It's such an important discussion. I'm very much a strong proponent of human rights. I'm very anti-communist. So these games were in particular of interest to me. Many around the world in the international community don't realize what the situation on the ground was like in the lead up to the Olympic Games. Yes, with the human rights conditions, but also in the preparation to get physically prepared for the games from the communist Chinese government. Could you share some of the stories that you've heard?
Well, I think first of all, we need to, be reminded that crimes against humanity happen in Xinjiang. 1 million people are imprisoned in those camps, and the people who are not in the camps are suffered to mass surveillance, torture. For people in the camps, suffered to torture, forced sterilization, forced abortion, horrible abuses going on in the camp. So for the people who are not in the camp, they're suffering, mass surveillance, and their freedom of movement, their freedom of speech are terribly suppressed. That's in Xinjiang. Then in Hong Kong, there are terrible, dramatic crackdowns on freedoms in the city. Then for the rest of China, there are horrible censorship, there are surveillance. So the situation for human rights is really bad. That's the overall big situation. In terms of the games, the Chinese government has stringently censored the criticism of the game. The Chinese people didn't choose to host the Beijing game. Then people criticize the game. Then they get censored and they get harassed. Activists warned by the government that if you say something bad about the game during the game, you would be detained or possibly imprisoned. So that's the big background.
My goodness. And along that theme of detention, we saw that many athletes who chose to come to the games, because let's be clear, several athletes chose themselves to boycott the games, but those who did participate, I saw video footage on Twitter and on various social media platforms of athletes in tears, decrying the treatment that I guess they weren't expecting when they traveled to communist China.
Well, I think, we have to know that it's the pandemic and their restrictions. Some restrictions are reasonable. I think people who participate in Tokyo Games complain too. But we need to know that there's censorship going on. So the government, try to suppress athletes talking about the bad conditions. Also, even for those who didn't complain, probably it's because they knew that if I complain about the conditions, there could be consequences, because the Chinese government has threatened that if you say, you threatened that you have to abide by Chinese laws and regulations, that's like a very fake threat saying, if you could criticize the government, you could be possibly punished. So we have to know that people who didn't speak doesn't necessarily mean that they don't have complaints.
Right. And we saw that some athletes said nothing while they were on Chinese soil, but once they returned home, then they started opening their mouths to some of the more egregious actions that they personally witnessed. We only have about 40 seconds left, and we can pick this up after the break as well. But how do you feel the IOC, the International Olympic Committee, has behaved with relation to China in this circumstance?
Well, I think they have done a terrible job. They have not spoken up about the human rights conditions in China at all before the game, during the game, after the game. At the same time, they have participate in the Chinese government's propaganda, especially regarding the Peng Shuai case, who's the tennis star who got disappeared after she made a sexual assault allegation against a very high-level official.
And actually, I want to talk about her case in a little more detail. We're going to cut for commercial break.